Last week on the Burning Archive, I looked at the biggest ocean region in the world, the Indo-Pacific. This week, I look at Eurasia, the biggest landmass, the biggest continental region of the world. Is it the Heartland, the world island of geopolitics? Welcome to the Burning Archive. I'm Jeff Rich. The Burning Archive is a podcast about world history and how it seems to be changing before our very eyes. Today's question: what is this concept of Eurasia that so many news shows, so many geopolitics shows are talking about, especially in the context, I guess, of the conflict between Russia and China and America, between the North Atlantic powers and the Eurasian powers? What is happening today that suggests a rebalancing of world power from the Atlantic to Eurasia, or even from Indo-Pacific to Eurasia, and if you like, from America to Russia and China? And what aspects of history and some real texts from history can we look at to gain some real insight into this issue? So today I'm going to look at this concept of Eurasia as a physical geographical reality, a human geographic reality. I'm going to look at Eurasia as an emerging set of geopolitical institutions or cooperation between states and governments of the countries of Eurasia. And that's what I'm going to cover in part one, this week's episode. And then in part two, I'm going to look at Eurasia as a historical idea, especially the ideas of Eurasianism in Russian thought. And finally, I'm going to look at the idea of Eurasia in one especially influential essay from the early 20th century, a fragment of the Burning Archive, as I say, a fragment of the cultural heritage of the world, and one that links back the idea of Eurasia to Western or Atlanticist North American and European thinking about this huge landmass. So first, let's talk about Eurasia as a physical, geographical and human geographical reality. At its simplest, Eurasia is the real physical continent formed by the two continents that we, by convention, know as Europe and Asia. In truth, there is actually only one physical continent. Europe is not its own continent. It is the Western Peninsula of Eurasia, and that one physical continent of Eurasia stretches from the Kamchatka Peninsula in the Pacific Ocean to the Iberian Peninsula in the Atlantic Ocean, and of course is bordered on its southern side by the Indian Ocean and on its northern side by the Arctic Ocean. Some people even argue that Afro-Eurasia is a single continental landmass, that there's a narrow land bridge between Africa and Eurasia, so that it really should be considered one big continent. Europe and Asia are continents of the imagination, and there are really only arbitrary or imagined boundaries between them, and the ideas of Eurasia and of Europe and Asia as distinct have been very much shaped partly by the actual maps, the actual physical human geographic realities of this continent, with its rivers and its mountains and its different sort of landscape features, as well as it's also influenced by the actual history of the peoples who've moved all over this huge area. And it's not really surprising that people have used ideas to imagine boundaries and ways of distinguishing themselves from different peoples across this huge, vast continent that has so many different regions, geographic regions, cultures and peoples. Eurasia covers around 55 million square kilometres, and that is around 36.2% of the Earth's total land area. And that landmass contains well over 5 billion people, so approximately 70% of the human population. So when people talk about Eurasia in its proper physical concept, they're basically talking about more than 2/3 of the world. As I said, it is bounded by those 4 oceans, and it was first settled by humans moving out of Africa around 125,000 years ago. You may know it is also the home not just of Homo sapiens, but of various other hominids. I think there are various hominids, including Peking man and Denisovian man. In fact, the winner of last year's Nobel Prize for Medicine, I think, his primary research was around the sort of DNA and whatnot of the particular kind of hominid found in Denisov in Siberia. So while Eurasia is very big, its demographic centre is not really the Euro part of Eurasia, it's much more the Asia part of Eurasia. In fact, recently people have developed this concept of the Yuxi circle, which is you can draw a 4,000 kilometre radial circle centred on Yuxi in Myanmar, which will encompass 4.8 billion people. So the demographic centre of Eurasia could certainly be said to be in Southeast Asia. However, the geostrategic heart, the idea heart, if you like, of Eurasia has long been Moscow. This is where the European state mingled with the Mongol horde, and this is where Europe, according to legend, defended itself with fictional gates erected somewhere on the Great Eurasian Steppe against those invaders from the east. Of course, one of the key geographic features of this continent is indeed the Great Eurasian Steppe, which on its most western point, I think, even includes parts of Austria, certainly parts of Hungary, the entirety of Ukraine, a huge area of South Russia, Kazakhstan, and going into, I think, Mongolia and even into parts of China. One of the great highways, so to speak, of human civilization. And if you check out my YouTube channel, I actually did a YouTube on the whole concept of the Great Eurasian Steppe a couple of months ago, so you can check that out there. It is a crucial continent, a crucial physical continent, and it has long been seen as the fuzzy boundary between the peoples of Europe and the peoples of Eurasia, or Eurasia, has long been fought over. The idea of Western civilization itself is a kind of reaction against those Eastern Europeans, those Russians, the East, the Orient, who have threatened Europe's eastern border. So why all of a sudden are people talking about the rise of Eurasia in world affairs, the growing power of Eurasia, the growing importance of Eurasia in geopolitics? And that's partly that nothing's changed about the human or the physical geography of Eurasia, but something has changed about the various geopolitical, governmental, the institutions of cooperation between national states in the Eurasian region. And that's what I'll talk about in the next section. Now, you might ask also, how can I get a kind of a coherent overview of the history and geopolitics, I guess, the emerging understanding of how that history has impacted the world today of this huge region of Eurasia. And I'm going to make 3 suggestions. One is Peter Frankopan's 2 books, The Silk Roads and The New Silk Roads. I don't agree with everything that Peter Frankopan says or writes, of course, but he, in that book, does provide a really excellent, accessible overview of both the history of this enormous region of the world, which, of course, was for centuries bound together by those great trade routes that were known as the Silk Roads. But also he provides, in the New Silk Roads book, a really excellent overview of the emerging economic, political, cultural, and I guess strategic vitality of these countries, many of which are not seriously considered in, I guess, mainstream Western culture, tend to get sort of dismissed as the stands and all that sort of stuff, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, etc. But it is an excellent overview of it, so I do recommend those 2 books. And then there is a book by Barry Cunliffe from 2015 called By Steppe, Desert and Ocean, The Birth of Eurasia. Barry Cunliffe is a British archaeologist, and this again is a brilliant, accessible account, of which is also a beautifully illustrated book as well, with lots of, because Cunliffe is an archaeologist, so there's beautiful maps, beautiful objects. It provides over many thousands of years a history of this extraordinary area of Eurasia. Highly recommend that book as well. And then if you want to, get a bit of a different alternative account as well, there is on Substack a great article by Peter Nemeth, who writes his Substack under the name of Nemets, Nemets, and that article is called 7 Ages of Western Eurasia, a brief outline of the 11 or nearly 12,000 years from the Anatolian farmers to the present. So it's a long article for Substack, but it's shorter than those 2 books or those 3 books that I recommended to you. So highly recommend that set of books if you want to get a good solid account of Eurasia. So why is Eurasia emerging so much? Why are people talking suddenly so much about the rise of Eurasia, its challenge to NATO? Why has this become an issue of that is talked about even in the context, for example, of Ukraine, the gates of Europe, the border between Europe and Asia? About a month or so ago, there was a conference in Moscow of the Eurasian Economic Union. And this is one of several institutions that have been established over the last 20 or so years, 30 years maybe, that have, in the same way as NATO and the European Union, provide forums for cooperation between governments on economic issues and social policy issues and foreign policy and defence and security issues. These institutions provide that opportunity for cooperation between the many countries of Eurasia. And in this context, Eurasia really doesn't include, I guess, much of the area beyond the boundaries of somewhere in Eastern Europe. And these institutions really formed, or began to form, I guess, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, perhaps particularly after the end of the catastrophic period in the 1990s that was so bad for so many of the former Soviet states. So these various institutions particularly began to rebuild from around about 1999-2000, and they include the Eurasian Economic Union and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but they also have other forms, I guess, in some ways. The famous Chinese government's Belt and Road Initiative is one such form of major cooperation between these powers, and these include extraordinarily large transport investment, huge railways and roads and other transport infrastructure development. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization itself was formed initially from a group of 5 states: China, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, and Tajikistan. Initially formed in 1996, and it progressively expanded. And it has always been dedicated to this concept of a multipolar world. In fact, in 1997, Russian President Boris Yeltsin and then Chinese President Jiang Zemin signed a declaration on a multipolar world. It has annual summits, and its membership has grown. So Uzbekistan has joined, India and Pakistan have joined, Mongolia, Iran, and Afghanistan are now observers, and a group of other countries are now what are called dialogue partners. So I guess they're in the waiting room of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and they include Belarus, Sri Lanka, so one of the island states of Eurasia, Turkey, Cambodia, Azerbaijan, Nepal, Armenia, Egypt, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. So really quite significant, and there's Egypt, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia are quite recent developments. Saudi Arabia, with its oil wealth, is clearly a significant new member. This is a region of the world that's 36% of the landmass and 70% of the people. I think take out Europe, it's not that, it's maybe 60% of the world's people, and it's obviously very important. The kind of goals pursued by these new geopolitical institutions are not necessarily hostile intentions against the West. At the recent Eurasian Economic Council meeting, Vladimir Putin identified the key objectives of the Eurasian Economic Council, which was really to deepen integration and to identify new areas for interaction, including expanding trade ties and economic integration, strengthening or creating a common trademark for the Eurasian Economic Union, like a made in Eurasia, rather than made in America or made in Australia or made in Europe. Strengthening technological sovereignty, particularly, I guess, in the context of sanctions and competition with the West. Digital independence, including a digital ecosystem, including online public services and e-governments. Financial sovereignty, and a new proposal from Russia to add a 5th freedom to the 4 freedoms which exist within the Eurasian Economic Council, as they do in the European Union. The 4 freedoms is a concept of the European Union, which is freedom of movement, goods, services, capital, and people, or human resources. Russia's proposed to add a 5th freedom, which is freedom of knowledge, implying common principles and standards of education, coordination of scientific programs, standardization of requirements for professions, and development of unified textbooks in technical and other subjects. Which that last move is perhaps a significant new move in this world. I guess it's starting to articulate a kind of a broad sense of culture, including scientific and technical expertise, a greater level of cultural independence of Eurasia from the Western world. Indeed, in one of these speeches, Vladimir Putin articulated that this idea could contribute to the formation of a common cultural space and, if you will, a common Eurasian ideology. Now, that's the translation. What the particular meaning of ideology there is not entirely sure. So there is a concept of Eurasia, I guess, starting to stand on its own 2 feet in the new world, the new multipolar world that's integrated into these various institutions. And you can also see that in the most recent foreign policy concept of Russia, which, to use like Anglo-Australian kind of terminology, is like its white paper, its foreign policy white paper, its articulation of its main goals and purposes in foreign policy. And there they talk specifically about Eurasia within Russia's concept of the world. It's not solely focused on Eurasia. There's no sense in which Russia is like obsessed with the idea of becoming, a new integrated concept, like a new Eurasian, superpower, so to speak. The Russian foreign policy concept articulates a whole series of global objectives and talks about a range of different regions, including the near abroad for Russia, basically its neighbours in the former Soviet Union. The world ocean, interestingly, it doesn't use the concept of the Indo-Pacific at all. It talks about the world ocean and the Asia-Pacific, but it also talks about the Eurasian continent. And within its discussion of the Eurasian continent, it talks in particular about its deepening relationships with China and with India, and that Russia, from paragraph 54 of its strategic concept, Russia seeks to transform Eurasia into a continental common space of peace, stability, mutual trust, development, and prosperity. And there are sort of 4 basic goals within that. The comprehensive strengthening of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization's potential and role in ensuring security in Eurasia. So, again, Shanghai Cooperation Organization is potentially not quite becoming a NATO, but it is certainly playing a greater part in arranging collective security in those areas. Establishing the broader Greater Eurasian Partnership by combining a whole set of multilateral organizations, including the Eurasian Economic Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Association of Southeast Asian States, or ASEAN, and China's One Belt, One Road initiative. It's like an inclusive idea of working with multiple multilateral institutions. Then strengthening economic and transport interconnectivity in Eurasia through a couple of some of these big transport infrastructure projects: the Baikal-Amur Main Line, the Trans-Siberian Railway, the North-South Transport Corridor, improvement of infrastructure of the Western Europe, Western China International Transit Corridor, and the Caspian and Black Sea regions, the Northern Sea Route, and also the China-Mongolia-Russia Economic Corridor. And then finally, the 4th aspect of their transformation of Eurasia into a continental common space of peace, stability, mutual trust, development, and prosperity is a place that we have tended to forget about after America fled Kabul over a year ago. The comprehensive settlement in Afghanistan, assistance in building it as a sovereign, peaceful, and neutral state with stable economy and political settlement system, which meets the interests of all the ethnic groups living there and opens up prospects for integrating Afghanistan into the Eurasian space for cooperation. So that is the actual statement of, I guess, the major country, the major state, the major power of Eurasia that is most closely associated with ideas of Eurasia as well. And again, it's not some, Eurasia wants to take over the world. It's really about Eurasia overcoming some of the historical and economic hurdles it has faced and promoting the growth and development of the extraordinary opportunity that is there. And that vision of opportunity you can also get through Peter Frankopan's book New Silk Roads, the sense in which this is has long been and will have a long future also of being a key region of the world, a key region of cultural, economic vitality of the world, not just some sort of forgotten zone for geostrategic conflict. Also, the Norwegian international relations scholar Glenn Deason provides some really excellent books on Eurasia, and I think what he calls geoeconomics, if you want to check those out. So that's, I guess, part of the reason why everyone's talking about Eurasia now. It's, I guess, the states of Eurasia are getting their act together. They're establishing these enormous, like I think the north-south transport corridor would link fundamentally, St. Petersburg and the Arctic even with Iran and India, and dramatically reduce transport times there. So there are these utterly enormous internal Eurasian transport projects going on that will change the flow of activity of people and goods and services dramatically over years to come. But of course, no one really spoke all that much about Eurasia in the West, at least, before 1991, and that was because, nearly half of Eurasia or more was integrated under one state, the Soviet Union, the USSR, the CSSR, and really, I guess, Eurasia has been a key idea to help provide a pathway for these formerly integrated but then disintegrated states to cooperate and facilitate neighbourly cooperation since 1991. But in doing so, they were also able to draw on long traditions of Eurasianism in Russian and Central Asian thought, and that's what I'll talk about next week. So I hope that discussion of the physical and human geographic reality, to some degree, some of the overview of the extraordinary human history of Eurasia as well, provides you a bit of a sense of things. And I think what I'm going to do is actually break this show into two parts and release them over 2 weeks. And in next week's show, I'm going to talk about Eurasia as a historical idea, especially Eurasianism in Russian thought, as well as how Eurasia is seen as a threat in geopolitics, in Western thought, especially in one influential essay from the 20th century by none other than Halford Mackinder, the geographic pivot of the geographic pivot of history. His essay that was published in the early part of the 20th century, in 1904 in fact, which has been fundamental in shaping not only Western ideas of geostrategy and Mackinder's ideas of Western strategy, the whole idea that he who controls the heartland of Eurasia controls the world island, i.e. Eurasia, and he who controls Eurasia controls the world. It's an idea that was used by the British and the American empires to try to dominate the world. But those ideas have, strangely enough, flowed back and deeply influenced some of the contemporary advocates of Eurasianism in Russia itself, including Alexander Dugin, the somewhat notorious philosopher who some people see as profoundly influencing Vladimir Putin, although I don't think he actually has terribly much influence myself over Vladimir Putin. He expresses some fairly extreme ideas, but I will get into that all next week in the show. So I hope you appreciate this episode, which I've tried to keep to a bit more of my objective time of 30 minutes or so. Just a couple of reminders. Please subscribe to my Substack, jeffrich.substack.com. I produce a weekly newsletter where I offer glimpses of the multipolar world, some of the things I'm reading, some of the things I'm writing. My weekly newsletter looks at those issues. It's a free weekly newsletter. You can subscribe just by entering your email at jeffrich.substack.com, and you can also there upgrade your subscription and become a paid supporter, and you'll get extra bonus content from me, a fortnightly essay, and I've just begun a series of articles or essays on the theme of the world crisis or the poly crisis. And I'm sort of, reviewing my old ideas that, there are four big themes that are shaping the world today of imperial rivalry, social fragmentation, political disorder, and cultural decay, and extending that in various ways, and I guess providing my current reading of what's happening in the world crisis. And I guess I'm serializing the writing of a book on this world crisis, and if you want to be part of that conversation, you can upgrade your subscription at Substack. I think it's like $8 to $10 a month, depending on what currency you're using, and you can support me and support my work, and that's a really great and easy way to do it. And you can also hop over onto YouTube, where I also produce some other content on history, culture, and contemporary events. And I will be having some news fairly soon about my upcoming book, but I might talk about that more in next week's show. So until then, everyone, do take care in these dramatic times, and do remember that what thou lovest well will not be reft from thee.